Tonight, we're stepping into the story behind Stax Records, the Southern soul label that helped define American music in the 1960s and early 70s. Most people remember the hits, the voices, the horns, the rhythm section that seemed to breathe together. But behind that warm sound was a complicated history filled with risks, heartbreak, loyalty, and quiet struggles. Stax gave the world artists who changed music forever. It also faced moments that nearly erased it. Contracts lost overnight, careers interrupted, a community shaken by tragedy, and through it all, musicians who kept showing up, instruments in hand, trying to hold on to something larger than themselves. Some of these stories were whispered in studio hallways, others unfolded slowly over decades. And one moment in particular changed the fate of the label almost overnight. Let's begin where the sound first came to life. Number 10, the theater that became a studio.
Kiev to Rome, from Paris to Venice.
But before the records, there was simply a building on East McLemore Avenue in Memphis. It had once been a neighborhood movie theater, the Capitol Theater. By the late 1950s, it had fallen quiet, the seats worn, and the screen no longer glowing. When Jim Stewart and his sister Estelle Axton bought the place in 1959, they weren't thinking about building a cultural landmark.
With voices of passion, let each heart sing loud.
They just needed a space where musicians could gather and record. But something unusual happened inside those walls. The sloped floor from the old theater seating created a strange, natural acoustics. Drums echoed differently, horns carried warmth through the room, and the musicians who came through the door, black and white artists working side by side during the height of segregation, created a rhythm that felt honest, almost conversational.
Discord from Athens' ancient whispers to the...
Before long, that old theater began producing records that felt alive. Yet, even in those early days, the future of the label hung by a thread. Money was tight, equipment was modest, and no one involved could have guessed how fragile the entire operation really was. Still, the music kept coming, and with it, the first real taste of success. Number 9, 'Cause I Love You by Carla and Rufus Thomas. When the record first started spinning in Memphis, it didn't sound like a national breakthrough. It felt more like a neighborhood celebration. Carla Thomas was still a teenager when she stepped into the Stax studio with her father, Rufus Thomas, in 1960. Rufus had already built a reputation around Memphis as a lively radio personality and performer, someone who knew how to make a room smile. But this moment was quieter. Father and daughter standing side by side at microphones in that converted theater. The song itself was simple.
Deep down inside, baby, hold your mama.
A playful exchange between generations, built around a steady rhythm and warm horn accents. Nothing flashy, just personality. And that was exactly the magic of Stax in those early years. The record started catching attention locally, then slowly beyond Memphis. When Atlantic Records agreed to distribute Stax releases, it felt like a lifeline. Suddenly, the small Southern label had a pathway to the national market. For a moment, everything seemed possible. But that agreement, made quickly and without much legal guidance, contained details that few at Stax fully understood. Ownership of master recordings. Distribution control, long-term rights. At the time, those words felt distant compared to the excitement of hearing their music on stations across the country. For Carla and Rufus, the record marked the beginning of something joyful, a family voice carried into the world. But for the label itself, it quietly opened a door that would one day swing back in a way nobody expected. Success had arrived, and with it, a contract that would later cost Stax almost everything. Number 8, Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs. Some songs arrive with a grand plan. This one slipped into existence almost by accident. It was 1962, and a group of musicians had gathered in the Stax studio after a vocal session wrapped early. Booker T. Jones moved over to the Hammond organ, letting his fingers wander across a slow bluesy pattern. Steve Cropper picked up his guitar. Louis Steinberg and Al Jackson Jr. settled into the groove. No one was trying to make history. They were simply playing. The sound that came out of that room was spare, steady, and confident. No vocals, no elaborate arrangement, just a hypnotic organ line that rolled forward like a quiet train moving through Memphis after midnight. Green Onions became one of the most recognizable instrumental tracks of the decade. It climbed the charts and introduced the world to the Stax House Band, later known simply as Booker T and the MGs. But the deeper story lived inside that room. Black and white musicians working together as equals during the early 1960s South wasn't just unusual. It was quietly revolutionary. Inside Stax, the music mattered more than the divisions outside the building. For a while, that spirit felt almost protected within those walls. Yet, the success of records like this also tied Stax more tightly to Atlantic Records, the company distributing their music nationally. And behind the scenes, the fine print in those agreements remained mostly overlooked. Green Onions sounded effortless, almost casual. But every note that drifted out of that old theater was slowly becoming part of a much larger business story, one that Stax didn't fully control. Number 7, These Arms of Mine by Otis Redding.
Arms of mine.
Sometimes a voice doesn't just sing a song, it changes the temperature of the entire room. Otis Redding arrived at Stax in 1962 almost by chance. He had been driving for another singer who came to record that day, and when the session ended early, someone suggested Otis try a song of his own. What happened next was quiet, but unforgettable. Standing in that modest Memphis studio, he began singing a slow, aching ballad called These Arms of Mine. His voice wasn't polished in the traditional sense. It carried rough edges, breath, and a kind of emotional honesty that couldn't be taught.
How grateful I will be.
The musicians listened closely as the song unfolded. The arrangement stayed simple. Organ, guitar, and rhythm section moving carefully beneath his voice. No rush, no showmanship. Just a young man pouring something deeply personal into a microphone. When the record was released, listeners heard that sincerity immediately. Otis Redding soon became one of the central figures of the Stax family. His performances were powerful, his presence magnetic, and his connection to the audience felt almost spiritual. Inside the studio, though, he remained known as a tireless worker.
Just be my little woman.
Writing constantly, refining songs, always searching for something deeper in the music. For Stax, Otis represented more than success. He represented identity. The label's sound, raw, emotional, human, found its clearest voice in him. But the story of Stax would soon encounter forces far outside the studio walls. Business deals, shifting ownership, and events no one could predict were beginning to gather in the distance. And one of those moments would arrive suddenly and leave the entire Stax family shaken. Number 6, I'll Take You There by the Staple Singers. By the early 1970s, the sound coming out of Stax had grown deeper, steadier, almost like a promise. I'll Take You There carried that feeling from the very first bass line. The groove was gentle but confident, built around a rhythm that felt less like a performance and more like a place you could rest for a while. Mavis Staples stood at the center of it all. Her voice didn't rush, it invited. Each line felt like it was being offered directly to the listener. Calm, reassuring, almost like someone reaching across the room and saying everything would be all right. When the record was released in 1972, the country was still working through years of upheaval. Civil rights battles, cultural change, uncertainty about what the future might look like. In that moment, the song felt less like entertainment and more like a small moment of peace. Inside the studio, the recording was surprisingly relaxed. The musicians built the track piece by piece, letting the rhythm breathe. Producer Al Bell understood that the power of the song lived in its simplicity. Nothing needed to be crowded. The result became one of the biggest hits Stax had ever seen. But behind the warmth of that success, the label itself was facing pressures that most listeners never knew about.
Hey y'all, got to make the world go round.
Distribution battles, financial strain, a company trying to grow faster than its foundation allowed. For the audience, the song offered reassurance. For the people inside Stax, it was a rare moment when the music felt bigger than the problems surrounding it. And listening now, decades later, that promise in Mavis Staples' voice still feels steady. Sometimes a song doesn't solve the world. It simply reminds us what hope sounded like. Number 5, Soul Man by Sam and Dave. Some records feel like pure momentum. Soul Man arrived in 1967 with that unmistakable Stax groove. Horns punching forward, the rhythm section walking confidently beneath it all. Sam Moore and Dave Prater delivered the vocal with grit and swagger, turning the song into one of the defining soul anthems of the decade. The track had energy, pride, and a sense that the music coming out of Memphis had found its full stride. But while the public heard triumph, something very different was unfolding behind the business side of the label. For years, Stax had depended on Atlantic Records to distribute its music nationwide. It seemed like a practical arrangement at first. Atlantic had the infrastructure, the reach, and the experience that the small Memphis label simply didn't have. What few people at Stax fully realized was hidden inside the agreement. Atlantic owned the master recordings, so when Atlantic was sold to Warner Brothers in 1907, the consequences arrived suddenly. Almost overnight, Stax discovered that nearly its entire catalog, hundreds of songs, including many of its biggest successes, belonged to someone else. The music that had built the label's identity was no longer under its control. Inside the building on McLemore Avenue, the realization landed like a quiet earthquake. Years of work, creativity, and cultural impact had slipped away through the fine print of a contract few had studied closely. Soul Man remained a powerful record, but behind the groove, Stax had just learned one of the hardest lessons in the music business. Success and ownership were not always the same thing. Before we move further into the story, if you're still listening, you're probably one of us. Subscribing helps keep these memories and stories alive. Number 4, Pools. Try a Little Tenderness by Otis Redding.
Just a little bit of tenderness.
By 1966, Otis Redding had grown into something larger than a recording artist. He had become the emotional center of Stax. Try a Little Tenderness captured that transformation perfectly. The performance begins almost gently, Otis easing into the melody with patience, letting the band move carefully around him. Then, slowly, the energy builds. Horns rise, the rhythm tightens, and by the final moments, the entire song feels like it's lifting off the floor.
Agrees and care, yeah.
It wasn't just a vocal, it was a release. Inside the studio, musicians often talked about the way Otis could guide a room without saying much at all. He trusted the band trusted him, and the performances carried a kind of electricity that listeners could feel immediately. By late 1967, his career was expanding rapidly. National tours, television appearances, plans for new recordings that would push his sound even further. Then, on December 10th, everything changed. Otis Redding's plane crashed into Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin. He was only 26 years old. For Stax, the loss was devastating. The label had lost not just its biggest star, but a voice that seemed to hold the spirit of the entire company together. In the days that followed, the studio felt unusually quiet. Musicians came through the doors, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Try a Little Tenderness remained on the radio, but every time it played, it carried a different weight. Sometimes a song reminds us how powerful someone's voice once was, and sometimes it reminds us how quickly that voice can be taken away. Number 3, Respect Yourself by the Staple Singers. By the early 1970s, Stax was no longer just a record label. It had become a symbol of resilience. Respect Yourself arrived in 1971 with a groove that felt steady and purposeful. The rhythm moved forward without hurry, while the message inside the song spoke directly to dignity, responsibility, and pride. Mavis Staples delivered the vocal with a calm strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. At that point in American life, the country was still working through the aftershocks of enormous change. Civil rights victories had opened doors, but many communities were still facing hardship, inequality, and uncertainty. Songs like this carried something different than protest. They carried resolve. Inside the Stax studio, the atmosphere during the recording was focused but relaxed. The musicians understood that the power of the record lived in the message, not in elaborate production. The groove was allowed to breathe. Every instrument left space for the words to land clearly. The result was a song that felt almost like guidance. Not angry, not confrontational, just steady. For listeners, it became a reminder that music could still carry moral weight without losing its warmth. And for Stax itself, the record reflected a label that was learning how to stand on its own again after losing so much of its catalog just a few years earlier. Respect Yourself wasn't about spectacle. It was about dignity. And sometimes, dignity is the quietest kind of strength there is. Number 2, Theme from Shaft by Isaac Hayes. By 1971, Stax Records was trying to do something few companies ever manage. It was rebuilding itself from the ground up. After losing its original catalog to Atlantic, the label faced an impossible-sounding challenge: record an entirely new body of music, fast enough to survive. Artists worked constantly. The studio lights on Macklemore Avenue stayed on late into the night, and in the middle of that rebuilding came Isaac Hayes. Tall, thoughtful, and unhurried, Hayes approached music with a different kind of patience. When he began working on the soundtrack for the film Shaft, he wasn't simply writing songs. He was shaping atmosphere. The opening track begins with a rhythm that feels almost cinematic. Hi-hat ticking softly, bass sliding underneath. Then those unmistakable wah guitar accents that immediately place you in the early 1970s. Hayes' voice enters like narration more than singing. Calm, confident, completely in control.
Who is the man that would risk his neck?
The record became a cultural moment. It topped charts, won an Academy Award, and proved something vital. Stax still had the ability to shape the sound of American music. But behind that success, The company remained financially fragile. Expansion had happened quickly. New buildings, new projects, new ambitions. Sometimes growth brings opportunity. Sometimes it quietly brings risk. Still, for a moment, Theme from Shaft felt like proof that Stax had survived the worst. The music was still strong, and the world was still listening. Number 1, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding.
Watching the tide roll away.
Some songs carry a feeling that time cannot erase. Recorded in late 1967, Dock of the Bay was different from anything Otis Redding had done before. The arrangement was sparse, the mood reflective. Instead of driving soul rhythms, the song unfolded slowly, like someone sitting quietly and thinking about the road behind them. Otis had been experimenting with a more introspective sound. There's even a small detail in the recording that became famous: the whistling near the end. It wasn't meant as a finished idea. It's planned to return later and add more lyrics. But he never got the chance. The record was released after his death and soon became the biggest hit of his career.
It's gonna come my way, so I'm just gonna sit.
Listeners heard something new in it, a softness, a contemplation that felt almost prophetic. And in a strange way, the song mirrors the story of Stax itself. A place built on passion, creativity, and community, but also marked by sudden turns, losses, and unfinished plans. When that final whistle fades out, it feels less like an ending and more like someone pausing beside the water, letting the tide carry their thoughts away. Sometimes music doesn't just capture a moment, it captures the feeling of time passing. When people talk about Stax records, they often remember the horns, the rhythm section, the unmistakable Memphis groove.
Sitting here resting my bones in this long.
But behind those records lived something deeper. A small studio in a converted theater where musicians from different backgrounds came together during one of the most divided periods in American history. Artists who believed the music mattered enough to keep showing up, even when the business side of the industry made things harder than anyone expected. There were triumphs, there were losses, and there were songs that still echo through living rooms decades later. If you've listened this far, chances are these stories feel familiar in some quiet way. Maybe you remember hearing some of these records for the first time. Or maybe they simply remind you of a time when music carried a different kind of weight. Thank you for spending a little time remembering them. And if you'd like to open another door from that same era, there's another story waiting on the screen now, R&B Legends Who Died from Overdose, one that explores a different corner of soul music history. Take your time. The music isn't going anywhere.